Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Good to see you, all of these familiar faces. I'm Cliff May. I'm the president of FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I think most of you know where you are and know who we are, but we were formed almost exactly 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it'll be in the new year, just after the attacks of 9/11/01. We're a policy institute. We look at national security. We try to find the best options. I know everybody's been very busy in recent days, and that it's been politics all the time, but it's important to get back to policy, and we're very pleased to have with us people who have been focusing on policy all that time. And I'm going to let FDD's John Hanna make the introductions, and then he's going to moderate our panel with Michael Gordon and with Tom Joscelyn. So thanks very much for being here, and John, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Cliff, and welcome everybody to FDD. It's pretty good turnout because it's not like anything else is going on in Washington, right? Very sleepy Thursday, like any in Washington. At any rate, really happy to provide you some relief, as Cliff said, from the drama of presidential politics, and very glad to see you here for what I think should be a really excellent discussion on an issue that is almost certainly going to be at the top of President Trump's inbox come January, which is the war against ISIS in general and the battle for Mosul and its aftermath in particular. Now, whether it takes several more weeks or what seems more likely several more months, it does feel like the American-led war against Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's so-called caliphate is at long last entering its final stages, especially now that the assault on Raqqa has also commenced. At some point in the not-too-distant future, it seems likely that the Islamic State, at least as a physical entity, administering really large tracts of territory and large population centers in the heart of the Middle East, will cease to exist in its present form. At least I think that'll be it'll be a necessary milestone in this campaign for sure, a turning point of sorts even in the nature of the conflict that America's been waging for the last 2.5 years, if not the past decade and a half since the 9/11 attacks. But as a lot of people before me have observed, taking down the territorial caliphate may in many ways be the easy part of this, figuring out what comes next, who takes control of the ground that ISIS eventually cedes, and in what manner that ground is actually taken, the nature of the battle, are in many ways the more difficult but also the more important questions. Questions that go to the heart of critical strategic issues for American policymakers, like whether Iraq and Syria will even survive as unitary states, what the impact of the battle for Mosul will be on Iranian and Turkish power and influence in the region, how the broader Sunni Shiite sectarian conflict roiling the Middle East will be affected, and of course, how the loss of Mosul will impact the future of the Islamic State specifically, and the broader Sunni jihadist movement worldwide more generally, including, of course, al-Qaeda and its various affiliates. So helping us sort through some of these issues, we're lucky to have with us Michael Gordon and Tom Joscelyn. Now, as most of you are well aware, hopefully, Michael is the venerable military correspondent of the New York Times, where he's been covering national security and defense issues for several decades now. Almost 30 years?
Thanks for that.
Yeah, okay. My pleasure. On these subjects, he's, without question, I think, one of the great reporters of our time, steeped in knowledge and understanding of the issues. And when it comes to the question of America's long, tumultuous, quarter-century military involvement in Iraq itself, Michael is, I think, it's fair to say, without equal. There simply isn't anyone, I think, more authoritative on these wars. His 3 books on America's wars in Iraq, The General's War, Cobra II, and The Endgame, are essential reading for anyone hoping to understand the topic. Michael's now hard at work on his 4th book in this series. This one, of course, focused on the war against ISIS, which will be published hopefully next year. And here at FDD, we're very proud that just this past summer and fall, Michael spent several months with us working on his manuscript as FDD's writer-in-residence. And for any regular reader of the Times, you're no doubt aware that in recent weeks, Michael has been back at the front lines of the war, covering the start of the battle for Mosul as an embed with the Kurdish Peshmerga. And he's just recently returned, maybe a little bit worse for wear, but we're very much looking forward to his firsthand account of how the battle is progressing, how it's being fought, and what the larger implications might be for the region and U.S. interests there. Joining Michael is Tom Joscelyn. Tom is a senior fellow at FDD, specializing in the global war on terrorism, and one of the country's foremost experts on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Sunni jihadist groups more broadly. He's the senior editor of FDD's highly respected Long War Journal, which I recommend to all of you, and I think has now become must-reading for professionals in the U.S. military and intelligence communities who are actually responsible for waging the war on the ground against Islamic extremism. Tom's also a trainer for the FBI's counterterrorism division, and you can read his articles on a pretty regular basis, usually in the Weekly Standard. The way this will work is that I'll engage Michael and Tom in a conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then for the final 30 minutes I'll turn to you people in the audience for your questions, and we'll try and break around 1:30. Okay, Michael, I'm going to start with you if I can. I guess generally, what did you see when you were at the war? Specifically, talk to us a bit about what the coalition strategy is for taking Mosul, and how is it going from your vantage point?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this. First off, I'd like to say, when you do anything like this for the New York Times or any other major media organization, you're part of a team. It's not a one-man show. So in what I did in covering Mosul for the opening phases, I had an excellent Kurdish stringer for the New York Times, Kamal Kakol, who is absolutely essential. We had a British security advisor. In case you don't know what a Peshmerga embed is, it's not like any recognizable form of embed. It's you supply your own vehicle, you supply your own food, there's no lodging except the ground or a building if you can find one, and your own generator, and you kind of go along with them and use your common sense. And none of this could be done if you didn't have the kind of support structure that I described that the New York Times provided, which was actually very essential. I kind of have some overarching points. I thought that the opening, the way this campaign unfolded was the Peshmerga had the Kurdish forces were the initial phase of the operation, and they secured a territory up to an agreed upon line that was worked out in advance with Baghdad and the Americans, and stopped and went no further and built a defensive berm. They met a considerable amount of resistance in doing that, but which I think is a little bit of a bellwether for what's to come. And then having hold this territory, the Iraqi forces, mainly the counterterrorism service, passed through their lines and carried on the fight into eastern Mosul. So that was sort of the structure of the opening part of the operation. And as on the positive side, I thought the coordination or deconfliction or cooperation to a certain extent between the Kurdish Peshmerga forces and the Iraqi security forces was pretty good. And if anybody knows the history of the region would realize that wasn't such an easy thing to organize. The Americans played a big role. Iraqi forces staged from Kurdish territory. I know it's supposed to be Iraqi territory, but the Kurds regard it as Kurdish territory. And that part went well. There's another odd element of the coalition that's been grafted on there, which is who I did see also. Turkish-trained Sunni militia under the command, so to speak, of the former governor of Nineveh province, Atila Najafi, and I went and saw them, the Nineveh Guardians. And they've been grafted on to the 16th Iraqi Army Division and accepted, and they're probably supposed to be an important part of the hold force. So that's I thought were all sort of positive signs, and the Peshmerga and the Iraqi forces I saw were fighting hard. I didn't see any lack of will to fight. They seem pretty determined in what is, I think, a bit of a grim undertaking. The wild card in this coalition is the Iranian-backed Shia militias, which are not part of the Mosul fight per se, but have managed to secure some kind of yet somewhat ill-defined role for themselves in an operation on a town to the west of Mosul, Tal Afar, where there are a lot of Turkmen. And that is something that bears watching. It's a potential flashpoint. It's something that has drawn the attention of the Turks, who have some 600 or 700 forces in Bashika in Iraq, because they're concerned about the Turkmen. And that is why I didn't see any sectarian behavior with the forces I was with, certainly, at least not while I was there. The role of these Hastashabi popular mobilization forces is something down the road that I think is a genuine source of concern. And lastly, ISIS is fighting hard. And in what I saw, the Peshmerga would cordon off a village, maybe build a berm around it just to protect themselves, but ISIS would come out at night with their car bomb attacks, which is one of their main precision-guided weapons. They'd pop out of houses. They're fighting to die. I didn't see any. The Peshmerga fighters I was with were persistent, and they didn't flinch, but they took a lot of casualties. They didn't think they got enough air support, which was a sign of their anxiety, and they themselves were struck by the determination of the ISIS fighters they encountered to sort of fight to the last man. I don't think they got too many ISIS prisoners. And so, since this is the outer crust of the defense, you can only conclude that when they get into the harder parts of the city in the western part of Mosul, it's going to be really tough going.
Is it clear to the Peshmerga that they're going to stop on the outskirts of the city? Is that the plan, or can you imagine that they may be needed to go actually into parts of the city?
The plan is for them to stop, and they have stopped. Mm-hmm. And the plan is also for them not to use the Mosul campaign as a rationale to seize more disputed territory. And that's a commitment they've made to the Americans, who, of course, supporting them financially and with 2 brigade equipment sets. So they seem content with that role. So the Peshmerga are not to go into eastern Mosul.
Yeah.
And the counterterrorism service, the Iraqi army, the federal police, and then the concept is, and I don't know how well it's going to really work, but the concept is that there is going to be some kind of hold force that'll be different from the assault force, that will include the JFE guys who I talked to them. They're from Mosul, they're from Nineveh, even though they may have a T-shirt that says University of Harvard, or Manchester United or something. But some kind of tribal element that I don't think is really coalesced yet, and some local police. So that's the concept, but I think we're a couple months away from that.
What was the size of the Nujayfi, the Sunni forces that the Turks had trained?
Well, I think he claims a couple thousand, and he was trained in this Bashika camp where the Turks are, but he had moved out to another camp on the northern front. And I'd say when I went there, he had I think he said 1,500. I don't know. Maybe there were 1,000.
Had they actually moved out yet from
yeah,
the camp?
They moved
out
out
from
from
the
Bashika.
16th?
They had, when I saw them, they had left Bashika. That was actually a requirement that was part of their commitment to distance themselves geographically from the Turks. But they also had to co-locate themselves with the 16th Division. And I think they're fighting under the 16th Division. I think some of the 16th Division is fighting with them. But I got just atmospherically, I got the sense that there was a reasonable amount of cooperation, because I had a lunch with them. and they had like, you know, all of their former, basically Iraqi military guys who've been cashiered by Jerry Bremer's order not to have, you know, when he dissolved the Iraqi army, who had now come back, but as part of Nujayfi's guys. But there was also a representative of the 16th Division who was sort of like a liaison officer in their camp. And you know, just from what I could see, that arrangement seemed to be working out okay.
Working out right.
And as the Americans support it, by the way.
Yeah, but so I mean, and I think the number of groups you've mentioned have sort of underscored just how complicated on the coalition side the battle space is. Peshmerga, Iraqi security forces, there are allegedly Iraqi federal police, there are Sunni militias, there are the Iranian-backed PMFs, not to mention regional players, Turkey, Iran, PKK even. How is this actually all being coordinated by anybody? Are there any levels of cooperation? Is there a command center that's issuing orders and deconflicting people?
Yes, I mean, I think it's certainly being coordinated, and we haven't even mentioned the Americans who provide. When I was in the northern offensive, the Americans were providing the artillery. You could tell because there was a village the Peshmerga went into, encountered a lot of resistance, pulled back out, and then a whole artillery barrage came down on that place, and it was very precise. And it had to have been American, and the Americans have acknowledged that they provided artillery support. So they have Apache attack helicopters, they have artillery, they have lots of air. But I'd say,
Troops on the ground, American?
well, guys who fire artillery are on the ground. So I
We
mean,
got 5,000, 6,000.
yeah, I mean, they have special forces on the ground. I saw them in their vans drive right by me. We have had a soldier killed. He must have been on the ground, right? So but I'd say it's been coordinated. But I got the my sense is while it's being coordinated and the Americans have a lot of influence, we're not completely dictating the strategy. For example, and you can take this up later, but one of the flaws in the strategy so far was they failed to isolate the town of Hawija before moving up to Mosul. I think the Americans I talked to very much would have liked to have done that. Iraq Abadi didn't want to do that. I don't know, he was in a hurry to get to Mosul. He didn't think he had the forces to do it because he wanted to protect the lines of communication or whatever. And I think the Americans are trying to use their influence to rein in the popular mobilization forces in Tal Afar, but when we don't have battalions of forces fighting there. We have a role, and so I think it is coordinated, and I think there's a lot of thought went into the plan, and I think the Americans played a big role in getting the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces to go together. Barzani went to Baghdad. All sorts of things have happened, but that doesn't mean we can fine-tune this strategy.
All right, Tom, let me bring you in here and focus a bit more on the enemy and what ISIS is doing, their reaction to the start of the battle. What do the first few weeks of this tell us about how they're going to sort of wage this conflict, and what can we say about how it's doing so far?
Well, I mean, they of course knew this was coming months and months ago. I mean, you can't actually launch an operation like this without a lot of planning, and Michael outlined all the forces on the other side, and they certainly knew that array of enemies was coming their way. But you start with their messaging to sort of their believers, which is one of the things we track, and that's changed dramatically over the last year. As they know that they're going to start losing ground in Syria and now Iraq, they've basically been preparing their followers for an indefinite insurgency, as opposed to this constant messaging of we have the caliphate and we've resurrected it and we're remaining and expanding was their long time sort of motto. Now it's basically we're going to fight to the death. So it's very much a change in their messaging and their believers. And we saw this with the Islamic State's spokesman, Abu Muhammad al-Anani, before he was killed. He released a message about basically the three big capitals of the caliphate, and they were Raqqa and Mosul and, interestingly enough, Sirte, Libya. And what he says in this message is basically we can lose all three. So there's an implicit concession that they could lose all three, but as long as we have the will to wage jihad to the end, the fight continues. And there was sort of that message was picked up again just recently. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the emir of Islamic State, he released his first message in 10 months or so, since December of 2015, and he was very much making a strong call to basically fight for every last foot of Mosul and territory around it. And he emphasized that basically the martyrs, that this was their time to achieve their martyrdom. And we've seen in the early fighting around Mosul, one of the many statistics we track is their use of martyrdom operations or suicide bombers. And in the first 3 weeks, they released these very clean, slick infographics to highlight this and market this to people. In the first 3 weeks, they claimed to have launched 108 suicide bombings around Mosul as part of the defense. You can't really independently verify that figure for a variety of reasons, but it seems credible to us based on all the reporting, the excellent reporting that Michael and his colleagues have done and others. You can see that they are executing that pace of martyrdom operations, suicide bombings. And to put that in perspective, if you think Cliff mentioned that 15 years ago, FDD was founded in the wake of 9/11. That year in 2001, there were somewhere between 50 and 60 suicide attacks by all terrorist organizations around the globe. Okay, so in 2001, the year that kicked off the 9/11 wars, there were about 50 suicide bombings or attacks around the globe by all organizations. The Islamic State this year, in 2016, through the end of October, is claiming 90 suicide attacks per month by itself. So they've claimed over 900 by themselves for the first 10 months of the year. And now, more recently, a lot of these are happening around Mosul, but this is how they sort of try to defend turf. And we were discussing with Michael beforehand, the suicide bombers are integrated into this complex sort of defense and assault system that they've improvised to basically warden off what they know are militarily superior enemies or foes. I mean, obviously they don't have an air force, they don't have a lot of the things that basically you would rely on for a military strategy, but the suicide bombers are integrated into this in a variety of ways. But what happens is a lot of times they'll go in and they'll smash through sort of the key infrastructure or the key vehicles in their way or the key forces that are in their way, and they will try to basically then usher in sort of more elite fighters behind them. We're seeing that there are more recent reports in the last 48 hours out of the fighting around Mosul that they have what they call these crashing waves. And so the suicide bomber will be sent in and basically will be the first jolt, and then behind them will be 50 elite fighters who have been trained to fight to the end, and they will fight as hard as they can. As they start to tire, they will withdraw from the fight, and then 50 more will go in. And sort of it's this sort of wave of jihadists that they're trying to send at their enemies to basically exhaust their foes. And one of the things going back through time and all this, and it's sort of a little bit funny but also depressing if you think about it. Go back to 2014 when the initial assessments of the Islamic State's force size were made by the CIA and others in the U.S. government. A lot of those assessments underestimated the number of fighters they have at their disposal dramatically. And that's really a key measure here we're trying to figure out in Mosul is exactly how many fighters do they really have. Because we've seen in numerous battles now where the number has been drastically underestimated. And we think that it may have been underestimated a little bit around Mosul as well. But it's tough to say. The other thing I'd say about their defense of Mosul is we were tracking earlier this year, there are certain sort of paramilitary forces within the Islamic State's guerrilla army that are sort of their elite fighters, including Chechens and including other sort of foreign fighters that are basically, these are the most highly trained fighters that they have. Then they have Iraqis, of course, in that status, and Syrians as well. But it's easier to track a lot of times the foreign fighters because they want to communicate with people in Chechnya or in France or wherever else that they're actually leading the charge. And the Islamic State, just to show how far in advance they began planning for this, in July, Abu Omar al-Shashani, who was the top Chechen military commander for the Islamic State and held one of the most senior positions under Baghdadi, he was killed on the southern approach to Mosul. And he was involved in actually capturing Mosul in 2014. They redeployed him months ago to start setting up and basically make sure that his elite forces were in place to start offering resistance. And so that gives you an indication of how far in advance they were planning this. But we're also seeing reports now of elite French fighters who were trained, some of whom may have been in the military in the past, and others, different countries. It just shows you how sort of sophisticated they are. Across nationalities, they have elite trained fighters that are ready to go.
And what, do you have a number in your head? Is it consistent with whatever the U.S. is putting out now about fighters actually in Mosul of 5,000, 7,000?
It's 5,000 is the last number I saw, but I've been tracking this for a month or two, and it started off. There was a 3,500 to 5,000, and then you saw one military official came out with maybe it's as high as 7,000. But if you think about it, I mean that's a lot of variation for relatively small numbers. I mean, the percentage basis, that's a pretty large variation. And we've seen that across the board since the beginning of this whole thing. Go back to 2014. The original assessments of the Islamic State's manpower was in the low single digits of thousands to upwards to 15,000, let's say. And then by September 2014, after they've overrun Mosul and all these other areas, all of a sudden the CIA comes out and says, whoops, well, it's actually 22,500 up to 31,500. So if you actually look at it, within just a few months, they basically doubled or tripled their force estimate size. And what we'll say is there's also this game that's played where they're trying to figure out who are the sort of true committed fighters within those ranks. And it's almost impossible. I mean, how could you possibly know that? You couldn't possibly know. We can't even get the total number right. How are we going to know exactly who are the most committed fighters versus who are conscripts and that sort of thing? But I fear, as I watch the battle evolve, that given how long in advance they've been planning for this, that there are more forces at their disposal that we have probably estimated. And
is it, just quickly, do you believe, based on the fight we've seen so far and the way they're defending and Daddy's statement, that they will fight for control of Mosul to the bitter end, or at least to slow this thing down? And
they have a certain percentage of their forces that are going to fight to the end, and then they're going to melt into an insurgency after that. Okay. And so this, even as they lose Mosul, they've already are starting to think about what the guerrilla warfare is going to look on the other side. They've already started thinking along those lines. They evolved out of a guerrilla insurgency organization. That's where they come from. As Michael and others have witnessed firsthand, they're using those types of sophisticated tactics now in the defense of Mosul on the perimeter. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to melt that. It's interesting. You asked me, are they going to fight to the end? One of the things that they tell Al-Qaeda, because there is this global rivalry that's not very well understood at all between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is unlike Al-Qaeda, which tries to melt away and doesn't defend territory in Yemen when the opposing coalition comes in, we're going to fight to the end because we're the real jihadists and the real believers. So they have to deliver on a certain amount of that in the fight, for sure.
Yeah. Michael, within a few days of the start of the operation, there was this fairly significant ISIS attack on Kirkuk, and which you wrote about in a quite amazing article, The Aftermath. You're talking to people about that battle and recreating it. Can you just talk a bit about that and what you think it says about ISIS's capabilities?
Yeah, that was an interesting episode, and after it occurred, soon after it occurred, I went to Kirkuk to talk to the governor, the security forces. I went to Suleimani also, because the quick reaction force, counterterrorism force that played a key role came down from there. So I tried to reconstruct what happened. I went to the hospital. I talked to some of the victims. There was a friendly fire episode in the middle of all of that was caused by the Iraqis military, which they never took ownership of. And there was all sorts of just incredible vignettes. But what happened, one of which I'll recount, but what was striking about it is they had 100+ ISIS guys managed to infiltrate into Kirkuk, probably mostly coming out of the Hawija area, and on 7 trucks. And they had a very precise knowledge of the city. They had specific objectives. One of them was the emergency police center. And what they did as their kind of first act is they bottled up that force so the emergency police couldn't get out of their base, and took the buildings overlooking it and pinned them down. Actually, they couldn't, and basically isolated them from the fight altogether. And then they anticipated that the counterterrorism group that Pulad Talabani leads would be coming back down from Suli. They set themselves off on the roads from there and ambushed them essentially. So they had to fight their way through, and they were basically trying to take the government center. So it was very well organized. These guys had GPS. Some of them had GPS, which was interesting. Some Kurds were among them, according to what I was told, but obviously it's predominantly Sunni Arab, for some Yemenis. There was an episode that's just like out of an unbelievable episode, but I interviewed the woman, and when they took this hotel overlooking, it's now a blasted wreck of a building, overlooking the government center, there was a dormitory essentially adjacent for Christian schoolgirls who were going to school because there's a university there, and they were trapped there actually throughout this whole saga. And I went to the local church, and they called these girls, said, first of all, silence your cell phones, for God's sake. Get under the bed, cover yourself and hide, turn out all the lights. And I talked to one of the girls who was there, and so she's hiding under the bed, and the ISIS fighters literally went into that room because they were basically trying to raid the kitchen, and got whatever food that was there, actually sat on the bed that she was hiding underneath, and ate the food, and then kind of moved on. And she just tried not to breathe, not to move, not to do anything. And I think there was about 14 of them, and they were all sort of rescued successfully, but they spent like a harrowing night trying to just hide from ISIS fighters who had the free run of the building, but who eventually went out and blew themselves up or whatever. So Kirkuk was showed their organization on the positive side. They failed to do what they thought they were going to accomplish. They thought they were going to do another Mosul. They thought they were going to come in there and spur and be received in a welcoming fashion by the Arab population and maybe spur revolt. And none of that happened. So that's the kind of the good news out of that. And apropos your point about the sophisticated media, one thing, and when they went into Kirkuk, they, and my Kamal pointed it out to me, they immediately put up a YouTube video. And it was a YouTube video, shows you their adaptability or degree of organization or sophistication. They put up a YouTube video from Mosul, okay? And it was people celebrating in the streets, horns honking, flags flying, and people cheering the conquest of Kirkuk, because life in Mosul's, I guess, like North Korea. You're just fed whatever you're fed. And they told them, we got Kirkuk, and the people were dancing in the street, and then they did man-in-the-street interviews with people, praising their brothers for their successful assault on Kirkuk, and that thing they had up on YouTube almost immediately.
Yeah, Mock News Agency, they're one of their main propaganda arms, had that video up very quickly.
Yeah. And so that was all synchronized or coordinated somehow with this assault.
Mock does that across the board, from everywhere from North Africa to Southeast Asia. You'll see reports or videos and media that comes out on a daily basis. It's totally integrated on the media side. It's the most efficient propaganda organism I've ever studied. And I like to say that basically I don't think the State Department could get out the same message in 8 different languages simultaneously, and yet the Islamic State does. So
Wow.
and very, very, very quickly. And it's with remarkable consistency. So.
Yeah. Michael, just on this point of the failure to trigger any kind of popular support in Kirkuk in response to this ISIS kind of counterattack, is that the experience that you saw with the Pesh, or that you're hearing about, that the Iraqi military is experiencing as they go into Mosul, that local population is just, if they ever were receptive to these guys, are just sick and tired and happy to be out from under their control?
Well, my own personal experiences were with the 2 Pesh operations, and then which lasted 36 hours or something each, and then the Kirkuk. But from what I can tell, there are a lot of just very desperate civilians in horrible situations who, at least when the Iraqi forces reach them, are glad to be, out of that situation. Now, I think they're from what I can tell, and also people I've talked to, I know who are out there, and there's some very intrepid NGO people out there doing all sorts of stuff in very dangerous circumstances I'm in touch with. At least so far, the population seems to be receptive and welcoming, and the Iraqi security forces, at least the CTS, seems to be conducting themselves professionally, but a significant number have been are still kind of being used as human shields. In the interior of the city, the UN's had a lot of reports on that. And then when I was on the northern front, and there was a town, Fazaliya, and a Peshmerga soldier told me, he came from there. So he said that, and he had contact through cell phones, which amazingly worked when I was out there. And he said that some portion of that city had been taken hostage, basically, by ISIS, and ISIS had told him, your relatives are fighting with the Peshmerga, and if they come here, we're going to kill you, and they had hauled them off to Mosul. So, you know, I just think this next phase of the battle, I feel like as difficult as this has been, this is just the prelude to a much more difficult battle when they're gonna have to fight in kind of constricted terrain in cities, on streets. The air will be harder to use air and armor. The weather is going to turn. And it's part of when the first operation I was in, the first night, we went down the road and then we got off that road real fast because it's all IED'd. And went on some flat desert terrain and then kind of came around the other way. But, you know, when the weather turns and it rains, that it's going to be harder to go off-road even. These forces depend critically on coalition air. And so what seems to happen is when the weather's good, I saw this in Sinjar too, they leap ahead, grab some territory, and then kind of back clear from there. And after, you know, when the weather's not good, they stand in place. And I can't blame them. So, you know, I think just looking forward toward it, and when going into Western Mosul, I just think it's going to be a tougher fight, and the city's not cordoned off. I mean, there's no evidence they're fleeing, I was told by Kurdish intelligence, but they could, but the city is not literally surrounded in the west. The west is not cut off.
And Tom, just sort of the West, I do want to, before we go to questions, touch on the regional dimensions of this. And
Can I give one quick comparison to Sirte, Libya here, to give you
Yeah,
perspective
okay.
on Mosul, then I'll go to West and the approach on Tel Afar. Just by comparison's sake, so to give an understanding of how hard these guys fight and how hard it is to eject them from one of their so-called capitals, the offense in Libya, the Libyan ground forces launched an offensive in May. The U.S. Began airstrikes on August 1st, Operation Odyssey Lightning, launched hundreds of airstrikes against the Islamic State, precision airstrikes against them. The Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, and Libyan officials and others have said that, you know, basically their time is up. They're down to a single neighborhood. That was weeks ago. Sirte is not nearly as favorable to them geographic-wise as Mosul is, because they're pressed up against the coast. They are cordoned off. They have a lot of disadvantages, and yet they cling to these several blocks in Sirte like it's, you know, basically this is everything for them. You know, they're going to fight to the death. And so that's a good comparison, I think, for what's happening in Mosul, and is a bad omen for what Michael thinks is going to come there. That basically, you know, that these guys resort to increasingly more savage tactics. They're not going to give it up easily at all, no matter what.
Yeah.
But on Tel Afar and the approach there and the popular mobilization forces we were talking about, Amir, our colleague who writes for us at the Lone Wolf Journal, I don't know if he's here, but he there he is. He plays Where's Waldo for us with a couple different characters on the PMF side. And has been tracking that on the social media, and we track that and who shows up, and we've already seen some alarming indications, I would say. You know, the popular mobilization forces, which are backed by Iran, of course. One of the chief guys in the PMF is Muhandis, who is a designated terrorist. He's been designated by the U.S. for quite some time. He reports to Qasem Soleimani, you know, who's one of the guys that Amir plays Where's Waldo with, who gets spotted in different areas. And we've seen some other sort of notable guys west of Mosul in the Tel Afar region, including Abu Azrel, who is basically the Shiite equivalent of ISIS. You remember last year or the year before, I don't remember when we wrote this up, he basically roasted alive some Sunnis in Western Iraq and treated them like shawarma. That's what he said. And then ISIS responded to that by roasting Shiite fighters and PMF guys alive and treating them like shawarma. And this is the sort of back and forth. And so that when it comes to the big danger of the sectarian Iranian-backed PMF forces, who fortunately have not, as Michael said, been involved in the other approaches to Mosul, this is the danger of what lies out west. And it really remains to be seen how that plays out.
Michael, can you talk a little bit about the role of the PMFs, what it is we think they're going to do, what's the larger Iranian game in, if there is one in Western Iraq? Why are they insisting on being part of this operation?
I mean, some of this is speculative on my part, but so the Popular Mobilization Forces contain a lot of different elements, but obviously the Iranian-backed, some of the more notorious groups, Kataib Hezbollah and Saib al-Haq are part of them. And they've insisted on a role in this operation, and Prime Minister Abadi is basically trying to balance off Iran and the United States, and they're a politically potent group within Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and there are lots of them. And so they've been given this role somewhat ill-defined out to Tal Afar. And what they've seemed to have done is they've incorporated in their force Shia Turkmen who fled when ISIS came, who were brought down to Jaf, Karbala, trained, and then brought into this. I think this is not an original thought, but I think the Iranian agenda is to cut what the military would call a kind of a lock, a line of communication to Syria that goes from Iran to Syria, that goes through Tal Afar, out to Sinjar, and off to Syria. In fact, some of these guys say they're going to go to Syria next. And I do know from being out in Sinjar last year that some of the Yazidi factions that don't get along well with the Kurds were talking to people like Mohandas. So I think the Iranian strategy is to have some influence, a ground line of communication out to Syria. I think Abadi's strategy is to balance off all these different competing forces within his country, and I think the U.S. strategy is to sort of make the best of damage limitation, and to somehow come up with an arrangement for Tal Afar in which the stabilization force does not include the worst of the PMF, maybe as local residents, maybe get them in dialogue with each other, and avoid some sort of sectarian revenge. And there is when people go back, and my colleague Tim Arango has been writing about this, when people go back, there are all sorts of issues to work out. ISIS has commandeered homes from people who fled and sold them or given them to incomers. And now when people come back, they're people in their homes. I mean, there's a lot of potential for trouble even after the operation is sort of near complete.
And have you actually been able to talk to any U.S. military officials about, I mean, it just seems like an odd thing. If you believe and have deduced that the Iranian strategy is not to occupy Mosul, but to develop this connection to Syria, to then give them in this operation, or let Abadi give them control of the West and the approaches to the Syrian border, is that just something that was unpreventable? Couldn't be stopped?
I don't think first of all, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, that's what I think their intent is. I mean, they're not in Tal Afar, and they're not. Second of all, there are other forces out there, but I think there's going to be a competition for control and authority in Nineveh province after, I mean, the Kurdish regional government claims Sinjar, even, as part of their own. I mean, there's going to be a competition among, there's going to be a struggle after the war for influence, for terrain, for who governs Nineveh, for how autonomous it is over borders and things that is sort of yet to come. But I think, and again, I think the U.S. strategy is to try to mitigate the problem of the PMF by embedding them somehow in the Iraqi security forces and getting some agreement from Abadi that the hold force in Tal Afar they're trying to encourage dialogue between the Din Turkmen community. We have some leverage. We provide the air, and it doesn't work too well without the air.
And we'll provide air for the battle in Tel Afar?
Well, I don't know. I
Depending on
guess
who the force
I guess
is,
if the force is an Iraqi security force division, to which, I mean, we provided air in a sense in Beiji and under certain circumstances where there were popular mobilization forces, but or you know, they have to be formally subordinated, maybe informally not, but to the Iraqi security forces, there has to be an Iraqi security force element.
Yeah. Tom, just quick on, have you detected any direct Iranian role either is Qasem Soleimani on the battlefield with the PMFs in the West now?
I mean, this is one of the guys that Demir plays Where's Waldo with. We got, Qasem Soleimani sort of pops up on social media and all these different places, and there are indications along those lines. It's hard to verify the photos a lot of times, but yeah, I mean, we track, if you look what the PMF says about Erdogan and says about Iran and how they're positioning themselves, that's what Michael said is exactly their plan for west of Mosul and the approach to Tel Afar. They want to have that corridor. They've even claimed that they've already broken the line of communication between Mosul and Raqqa, which is an exaggerated claim, of course, but that shows you where they're going with what they want to do. And they clearly they want to position that way. And you had mentioned some, the PMF is talking about going into Syria. We already see some of these militias, these Iraqi militias, including one of them, Harakat al-Nujaba, a big one, which we see in Aleppo fighting, regularly. So, they've already done that. They've already made that transition to Syria. But they want, exactly as you outlined, they want to position themselves for this corridor from west of Mosul into Syria.
Yeah. Michael, quick before we go to the audience, two things, and we haven't even talked about the day after plan for Mosul and whether anything can be put together, but the Turkish issue or Turkish problem in the battle for Mosul, which has been a subject of controversy and some level of concern that it could somehow become a flashpoint, particularly with the Iranians, but maybe with certain Kurdish elements. If you can just talk about what you experienced or heard about the Turkish role and how it's being managed, and then also just what you saw about the specific missions the U.S. forces are actually playing, and is that likely to grow? Could we see U.S. forces go with Iraqi troops into Mosul? How close are they to the actual fight on the ground?
So on the Turks, my understanding is they're up and around Bashika, and also there were 600 to 700 Turkish forces. They have tanks. When I was in Bashika Mountain last February, they had 2 tanks there. They had some artillery. The artillery may be active, but I didn't see any Turkish direct, from what in the particular things I was part of, I didn't see any direct Turkish involvement. I think it's more of a deterrent and a prospective threat. The Turks, well, Erdogan said it, they want in on the operation. They want to be part of the ATO, which is the Air Tasking Order. They obviously, Prime Minister Abadi doesn't want that. What I think Abadi wants is the Turks aren't going anywhere, and the Iraqis are in no position to kick them out. They have their hands full. They can barely do Mosul. Okay, and I think what the Iraqis would like is a commitment up front from the Turks, saying, okay, once this fight is over and we reach stability, when that day comes, you begin to withdraw from Iraqi territory. I think Iraqis would probably be satisfied with that. And what the U.S. seems to be doing, and I don't know everything they're doing, but is kind of behind the scenes trying to broker a solution to that effect, and maybe as another damage limitation exercise, cut the Turks in on the operation, but in a way that's not too obtrusive, support or training or civil affairs or something like that. I mean, I saw Ambassador Khalilzad suggested Bashika could be turned into a coalition base. Right. I mean, there are a lot of gimmicks people are trying to come up with, but I don't know if any of that's going to work. The Turks don't like the PKK, and they're worried about Tel Afar, and they're trying to project influence in that part of the world. Apropos the Americans, they're doing artillery support. They're Apache air weapons teams firing Hellfire missiles. There's some artillery. There's also French artillery involved. Was operating previously out of Carrera West. There's advisors who go with the counterterrorism service. There's already one American killed in action. I saw some follow the Peshmerga kind of special forces types. There's the so-called Expeditionary Targeting Force, which is the special operators who've been active for like many months already, conducting raids selectively under kind of classified, cloak of classification. There's British up there, there are Canadians, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So there are boots on the ground. In that sense, there's not major combat formations like the Iraq War, but there are boots on the ground. U.S. forces are on what I consider to be combat.
Yeah, and Apaches are flying?
Apaches have been active for a while up and around there.
On Tel Afar and the Turks, I mean, there's been a lot of very heated rhetoric from the Turks about, do you actually think that if Shiite Turkoman PMFs were in the lead going into Tel Afar, that the Turks would fight in Tel Afar against these guys?
I don't know what the Turks would do. I mean, that seems to be the flashpoint the U.S. is trying to head off.
Yeah.
The PMF, by the way, is acting like that's a threat because, and that just in terms of the rhetoric, they refer to Erdogan's dictatorship and how he's trying to extend his control down there, and that so they, at least rhetorically, are responding to that issue.
Okay, I haven't exhausted all my questions, but I do want to go to the audience. Mr. Ambassador, we're going to give, if you wait for a microphone, Ambassador Faley here, right here. If you just identify yourself for everybody. And
Lukman Faley, previous ambassador of Iraq to the U.S. Well done, and thank you very much for both of you and for the host as well. With the transition in here in Washington between the administrations, where do you see the areas of contention in policies, if any, for the next few months between the Obama administration transfer and the apologies. I'm reading a lot about and the Trump administration, incoming Trump administration.
we got you. Specifically regarding this battle in
Yes,
Mosul and ISIS.
because this is the acid test in relation to the, at least on the Iraqi side. I'm not even getting around the Syrian side.
Yeah, okay. Michael?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question. And so I think the intent of the Obama administration was to try to wrap up Mosul before the end of President Obama's term in office. I think, he wanted to, as the rhetoric out of the White House says, put ISIS on the path of lasting defeat. And they got a simultaneous operation in Raqqa, which has some strategic sense to it because you don't want guys running from Syria to reinforce Mosul, so you announce you're doing Raqqa too even before you're doing it to kind of hold them in place. But I think this is going to be an extended operation just because it's hard going. So I think it's very possible that the fighting part of it will extend into the Trump administration. And it's certainly the case that the stability part, which we haven't talked about, but who governs this part of the world, which governor, the current governor, the previous governor, how much autonomy, all this, if you don't solve the sectarian issues in a way, then all of the root causes that gave rise to ISIS in the first place, and which will sustain their insurgency will continue to exist. And that hard part, I believe, is going to be dumped in the lap of a Trump administration into a president-elect who said he's not going to do nation building, has a secret plan to conquer the area, and has talked from at different times about getting in, getting out. He has no clear strategy that I can discern.
And holding the oil fields.
Yeah, but there's some degree of not nation building in the sense of rebuilding the electricity, but nation building has to go on. Services have to be restored. The Americans have to play some kind of role as an effective interlocutor with a special envoy or somebody as a catalyst, I think, to help things progress there. And now sort of the time to play that role because we have maximum leverage because the air is essential. But I think in reality, a lot of this is going to be put off to administration that has yet to articulate any kind of clear strategy and for how it's going to proceed.
Can I just, have you heard any talk amongst the U.S. military? Do they think they need to maintain a post-ISIS presence in Iraq now? Do they want to move for that and stay there now?
I think it's understood by all kind of clear-thinking people that that there has to be some, U.S. presence there. First of all, the Iraqi army is still a work in progress. And when we had an experiment where we left and we saw what happened to it, and it didn't work out too well. There is going to be a continued counterinsurgency. It's not going to be like flipping a switch and this whole thing's off. And, so I think there's going to have to be, I think the U.S.'s situation in the KRG is pretty secure up in where they're operating from. But I think there has to be some sort of continued U.S. presence for training and for actually military operations that will persist. And that also has to be defined by the next administration and worked out with the Iraqi government and somehow worked out in a way that the Iranians don't do what they did during the Iraq War, when they actually directed the militias to kill Americans.
And you've got to do it. I think Iraqi provincial elections are in 2017? 2018. Okay, well, that's a good thing anyway. Yes, Derek Harvey.
Yeah, I think you started to touch on the issue.
Derek, just identify yourself quickly for so everybody knows who you are.
Derek Harvey, currently with the House Intel Committee, but
One of the nation's foremost experts on Iraq. But yeah,
I've
go ahead.
worked Iraq since 1989. You started to touch on what is really the most difficult part, and we've been down this road before, which is what comes next.
Right.
Winning the fight, and what you've described, despite your characterization of it being very difficult and convoluted and complex, this is the easy part. And you're still going to have a very significant insurgency. Tom, you mentioned the numbers issue, and we're going to transition into an insurgency of a different type here. But if you looked at the numbers that have been reported week to week to week of the losses of ISIS just in Iraq alone, they number over 50,000
Sure.
in the last 12 to 15 months. That's looking at Iraqi reporting and contractor reporting and embassy reporting.
Which shows you that the initial estimates of how many they had were far off. But yeah, they've sustained huge losses.
And there's going to, unless you get this next part right,
Yep.
and it comes to political will and commitment and trying to align a lot of things like a Rubik's Cube, very difficult. I'd like you to address that just a little bit more if you could, and the issue of the resilience of an insurgency that's
Right.
probably going to still remain there unless you get this other part right. And it's not just these major groups. The intra-Sunni fracture there is a major impediment, whether it's Anbar or Nineveh. If you
And-
could just touch on both.
And we've also obviously got all these smaller minorities as well. We've got Yazidis that want
Shabak.
certain things,
Christians,
Christians that want certain things. Michael, have you seen any evidence of a day after plan? You were talking about who's going to govern here, who's going to police there. Do you have any confidence that this has been worked out, or is it all going to be done on the fly and kind of left to the Iraqis?
No, there's some premeditation that's been put into this, and I don't know the whole planning has not exactly been shared with me. But from as I understand, there is a kind of a rudimentary. There's a structure. The governor is going to come in is going to be this guy Nafal Agoob, the current governor, because the body wants to maintain the current structure. He's supposed to have two deputies, one that or representatives who advise him, one that from President Barzani and one from a body. They're talking about an idea of setting up some sort of wise men thing to try to work things out. There are a lot of issues that are unsettled, and I did an interview a while back with Athil Najafi, the former governor, and who doesn't think there's a properly developed plan, really, and he put forth a scenario where different forces were going to grab different parts of Nineveh, including his forces, and then kind of negotiate from there about political arrangements, and from a position of some greater leverage. Namely, you occupy a neighborhood of Mosul, or you occupy part of Nineveh, so let's talk about how we're going to work this all out. So it's not agreed on in advance, and the administration's argument is, well, if we try to work everything out in advance, we'd never get this operation, going. But the counter argument to that is, well, it has been 2 years since Mosul fell. But no, I think there are a lot of difficult issues that are going to have to be thrashed out. I mean, I agree with you, Derek, completely.
Yeah, and it is really Groundhog Day, because we have been here not only in Iraq, but we were there in Libya, all of these issues about day after governance issues, about reconstruction, which I've heard very little about, how much money is available, who's going to do what to try and rebuild these places. If you look at some of these other Iraqi cities that have been taken out west, there's almost nothing that's occurred of any substance on the reconstruction side. Let me make sure oh gosh, yes, this right here, Marina, yeah, Is there a microphone?
There have been several mentions of the Sunni militias, particularly the ones close to Nujafi, participating. And my question is, are there different Sunni militias participating, and how significant are they? Are they in terms of numbers?
Marina, can you just identify yourself and where you're from?
Marina, Ottawa, with the Wilson Center.
Well, Nujafi claims to have around 3,000 guys, and they're about, when I saw them, they're about half of that involved in it. Well, the significance is they're from Nineveh and Mosul. And the idea is that there is some logic to having people, you don't want a Shia army, however, even if it conducts itself impeccably, or the federal police, which control a lot, Badr Corps elements or people like that, occupying Mosul any longer than you have to. So the significance of it, and the Americans actually support this, is that it'd be good to get some people from Mosul involved in securing Mosul, along with the local police and whatever tribal elements they can rustle up, for after the city's taken. But there are limited numbers of them.
Right, it does seem, I mean, it's relatively astounding that almost 2.5 years into this operation, where this is the most important city in Iraq that needs to be taken down in order to defeat the caliphate, that you maybe, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000, you're looking for a few others, that this hasn't, you're not talking 10,000 or 20,000.
They're claiming a lot.
U.S. trained Sunni
They've thrown
militia.
out, the Pentagon has thrown out a large number on tribes. And they've talked variously, 10,000, I forget, 10, 15,000, but I'm dubious of that. That number has been actually materialized.
Anybody over? I'm going to go over there, then I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to go over here. Yes, please. Yes. Just wait for the mic, it's coming, I think.
Okay, I can talk pretty loud. Victoria Tansing, lawyer. Do you think the Kurds will declare independence, and if so, how and when?
I don't. I think that I can't predict their intentions. They were talking about having a referendum this year. But, I mean, part of a potential good news thing is, President Barzani went to Baghdad. There was a meeting between the Kurds and the Iraqis. He doesn't go there very often. And I went to, after the first operation, I was at a joint press conference where the president of the KRG, some senior Iraqi military officers standing side by side, and all the talk was sort of positive. It was about cooperation. It was about not overstepping and using this operation to grab new territory. And so I do think, plus the Kurdish economy is in terrible shape, and they have their own differences. So I actually think I'm not an expert on Kurdistan, but I actually think the push for independence or declaring independence is going to be deferred for a while.
Is the U.S. encouraging them to defer, do you know?
Well, the U.S., the administration's position has always been that it's better that Iraq be kind of a federal system, but a unitary state.
Okay, yes, sir, please.
Dr. Ibrahim Saleh from Kurdish National Congress of North America. I lived in Mosul for 7 years, and the young generation of Sunnis, they are either Arab nationalists or they were Ba'athist. I don't think they hope any prosperity for Kurdistan, for sure not. Besides that, this sectarian unrest going on and going on, isn't that a time for we really considered for fairness what we suffered, the Kurdish people, from all consequences governments we saw over the last 40, 50 years? Isn't that fair for us to have independent Kurdistan, or at least Vice President's plan. Really, there is no way we can live together. This is that is really the for sure aftermath after Mosul. There is a lot of problem going to happen again. I think for fairness, United States and alliance should, and we are the front line. Really, the Peshmergas are really the ground. The force they fought, and they created for us 700-mile enemy terrorists against us, withdrawing whole one-fourth of the military, Iraqi military from Mosul. They left in the hands of the terrorist organization, and we are the one who suffered, are still suffering. We have 2 million people.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a statement and go on to another question. Rafi Dangzinger, yes.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Number one, we haven't heard anything about Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is deeply concerned about the Iranian role in Iraq and Syria. Doesn't Saudi Arabia behind the scenes at least play some kind of role there? And number two, there were some reports that just like the Viet Cong way back in Hamas in Gaza, ISIS is also preparing an underground presence through tunnels in Mosul. How serious are the reports, and to what extent can they actually slow down the advance of the forces? Thank you.
Take Saudi.
I was going to take the tunnel side, but yeah,
Take the tunnels.
I'll take the. I mean, the tunnel network is extensive. There's a lot of reporting on this now, and this is part of what Michael's described, where ISIS can basically appear out of nowhere on their enemies because of the tunnels. They're using that, snipers, IEDs, VVIEDs. There's a whole combination range of things they're doing. The tunneling network, according to Reuters, which reported in the last 24 hours, is incredibly extensive and is going to slow things down tremendously. Just a quick note on the Saudi side, and it's complicated what Saudi's interests are here as well, but one of the things we track is the PMF's rhetoric going back and forth with the Saudis. The Saudis, of course, accuse them of being sectarian and anti-Sunni, and the PMF is very adamant in trying to fire back. And what the PMF has is sort of a propaganda campaign right now to say that the Christians in Mosul, your church bells are going to ring once again, that we can all work together, and they're trying to emphasize that this is not just the Iranian-backed militias, but beyond that. And it's just an interesting thing to keep an eye out for, to watch the war of words between what goes through Saudi establishment media and sort of the PMF back and forth.
And I think even the Saudis finally, after a decade or more, sent an ambassador to Iraq who actually had to leave because of his criticism of the PMF and their role. It didn't end well, and ended very quickly. Michael, there was anything on Saudis? Does anybody believe they can actually play a role militarily if things go badly? The Iranians overstep. Are the Saudis capable of doing it and making trouble? We doubt it. Okay, yes, right here. We're going to get two very quickly, then I'm going to wrap up. You, right there, 1 and 2.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert Wolf. I'm from Congressman Steve Shabbat's office. One thing that hasn't come up is the Maliki factor, and whether or not he's really playing a spoiler. There have been some pictures of him on walkie-talkies, supposedly directing forces loyal to him. I'd just like to hear your take on, how disruptive Maliki's being, how much of a challenge it's going to be, in the fight against ISIS.
Okay, and can you hand the mic right here? Quickly, sir.
Thank you
If
so
you
much, Shwan Said, a contractor with the Department of State. My question goes to Mr. Gordon. Since you mentioned ISIL attempt on Kirkuk, don't you think, and you spent a lot of time in Kurdistan, don't you think corruption in the Kurdish government plugging the area and feeding the instability, and ultimately this will serve radicalized groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda? We all know that the undemocratic practices by al-Maliki served them in 2014, and they occupied half of the country.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I'll let Michael go.
Okay, Michael.
Well, just quickly on Maliki, actually I met him last February, I think. I mean, he's clearly I wasn't in Baghdad this last time. I was in Erbil and KRG, but he's clearly a significant political player, thorn in the side of Abadi, and involved basically trying to undermine him at every turn, is what it appears. And Abadi, and this is something I think, is using the but Ambassador Faley can probably explain all those better than I can. But the Abadi is using the Mosul campaign to try to project his own image as being a strong leader and figure. And so I think part of the impetus behind Mosul, I know the President-elect Trump was complaining that the operation was telegraphed in advance, but the Iraqis were telegraphing it in advance for their own political reasons. And on the night the operation began, and we were living in some concrete, unheated floor, you know, and it was supposed to kick off around 4 or 5 the next morning. This is the very beginning of the Mosul campaign. And when you do any of these things, you know, the ground rules, operational security, is that you're not to write about it until it like starts, because that's, you know, it's understood that those are the constraints you're under as a reporter. You don't want to telegraph to the enemy that the attack's coming. And so it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and I get a phone call because cell phone service is still working from the foreign desk in the New York Times. They said, "The war is on," and I said, "Well, not really, you know, not where I am, and I mean, it's not for 3 more hours, and we haven't moved out yet. Everyone's still sleeping, you know." I'm just like, I know we're supposed to move out at 5 a.m., but what had happened was Prime Minister Abadi had gone on Iraqi television wearing a military uniform, with his generals, and announced, taking credit, announcing, projecting his own image for his own political purposes as being the strong figure, was the guiding hand of the campaign. And then, you know, well, sure enough, 3 hours later or so, the war was on. So that's one way in which I think it's affecting politics. On the Kurdish, I'm not an expert on the Kurdish economy, but obviously it's not in good shape. There's corruption is a big problem. Quabad Talabani, is the deputy prime minister, is trying to get a handle on a lot of very deep problems like ghost employees. They have a plan now where they're trying to actually count all the people who really come to work for the Kurdish government and the ones who don't exist. And he's, you know, I think they're doing some work on that. But, you know, they have their own governance issues and political divisions which will persist.
Actually a report out by a couple of people who recently visited that claims that there's actually fairly significant reforms taking place. One of the more positive aspects of a lot of bad things happening in Kurdistan.
I saw him when I was out there, and I think he himself is making an earnest effort.
Yeah. Okay, unfortunately, we run out of time. I got to close it down. I do want to first thank Aaron Blumenthal and the entire FDD team for making all these great events possible. Please join me in thanking Michael Gordon, Tom Joscelyn. Great discussion.